It was a gray morning when Jimmy Swaggart, the well-known televangelist and gospel preacher, walked quietly through the front doors of St. Gabriel Hospital. He wore a simple white shirt, slightly wrinkled, plain trousers, and worn shoes. In his hand, he carried nothing more than a small Bible and a thermos of coffee. His hair, no longer youthful but carefully combed back, gave him the look of an ordinary old man. Nobody recognized him as he entered. The hospital, located in a growing urban area, had recently been placed under the administration of a private foundation. Few knew that this foundation was heavily funded and supported by Swaggart himself, who after years of fame and ministry had chosen to invest part of his fortune into quiet social projects, away from cameras, away from the pulpit, far from the spotlight. That day, he was not there to preach on television or hold a revival meeting. He had made the deliberate decision to visit the hospital in the disguise of a common man without announcing his presence, to see with his own eyes how the poor and vulnerable were being treated. His goal was clear: to find out whether compassion and human dignity were still alive in modern medicine, or if cold systems and indifference had replaced them. The emergency waiting room was filled with tension. Coughing patients sat slumped in uncomfortable chairs, elderly men and women rubbed their aching joints, and young mothers cradled restless babies. A woman whispered a quiet prayer, her hands trembling. Nearby, a young man pressed a blood-stained rag against his hand, ignored by those walking past. Everyone seemed invisible to the staff who rushed by without even a glance. Jimmy sat silently in a corner, not to interfere, but to observe. He made discreet notes in the margin of his Bible and offered a warm, fatherly smile to those who met his eyes. A little boy, too shy to speak, handed him a piece of candy. Jimmy accepted it with tenderness, nodding his thanks. "Have you been waiting for hours too?" asked a weary, pregnant woman beside him. "Yes," he replied gently, "but I'm more concerned for you all than for myself." She gave him a tired smile, comforted by his calm presence. Moments later, a young doctor hurried into the room. His name was Rodrigo, known for his efficiency, but also for his lack of kindness. His white coat was spotless, his watch expensive, and his face wore an air of superiority that had followed him since medical school. When his eyes landed on Jimmy, this older man with simple clothes and a relaxed posture, he frowned in disdain. "Sir, this is not a place for drifters," he snapped without hesitation. "We treat real emergencies here. If you don't have a file, please leave." The words cracked through the room like a whip. Several patients lowered their heads, others shifted uncomfortably. Jimmy remained still, his face calm. "I'm waiting like everyone else," he said softly. "I'm in no hurry, and I am no vagrant." Rodrigo scoffed, muttered something about people wasting time, and turned away toward the restricted ward. The silence left behind was heavy. Jimmy smiled once more at the pregnant woman and at the boy with the candy as if nothing had happened. But inside, he recorded every gesture, every glance, every word, not in bitterness, but in prayerful reflection. At no point did he consider revealing himself. He was not there as a celebrity preacher. He did not seek special treatment. He only wanted to witness the truth. Jimmy only wanted to see if compassion still had a place in a setting where health should rise above social judgment. And though in his first hour he had tasted the sting of prejudice, he had also seen humanity in the weary eyes of the patients. That gave him hope. The real test, he thought, has not even begun. The waiting room remained crowded, the air growing heavier with each passing hour. Patient and observant, Jimmy missed nothing. While others shifted uncomfortably in their plastic chairs, he sat quietly, sometimes jotting notes in the margin of his Bible. He noticed a tired yet kind nurse offering a glass of water to a nervous young mother, a security guard arguing with a patient who lacked proper documents, and above all, the faces of men and women waiting not only for medical attention, but also for dignity and respect. Then Rodrigo, the young doctor who had dismissed him earlier, appeared again through a side door, followed by a nurse struggling to keep up. "Doctor, the man with the deep cut is still waiting. It's been over 2 hours," she whispered anxiously. Rodrigo frowned. "Do you think I'm going to leave an insurance client to attend to that? Let him wait." "We are not here to do charity," he added in a low but careless tone, loud enough that several patients overheard. Jimmy's eyes fell on the injured young man clutching his bloody rag tighter, lowering his head in resignation. Moments later, Rodrigo noticed Jimmy again, still seated calmly in the corner. His face hardened. "You again," he snapped. "I told you this place isn't for drifters. Leave before I call security." A mother nearby, visibly uncomfortable, murmured, "But he's not doing anything wrong. He's waiting just like the rest of us." "And who asked you?" Rodrigo retorted without even looking at her. "This place is filling up with useless people. What a disaster." Jimmy stayed silent, not because the words didn't wound, but because he understood something others didn't. Arrogance is not defeated with shouting, but with humility. He took a deep breath, pressed his Bible against his chest, and slowly stood. "Don't worry, doctor. I did not come here to be a burden. I am simply watching." "Watching what? Who did you come with? A family member?" Rodrigo asked with mocking irony. Jimmy met his eyes with a calmness that disarmed the room. "I came with no one. I came to observe, to learn." "This is no place for social tourists," the doctor scoffed. "We treat patients here, not spectators." The nurse at his side swallowed hard, wanting to speak but holding her tongue. Then an elderly woman stood with effort. "This man has been kinder to us than some of you," she said firmly. "He sang a hymn softly to calm my granddaughter, and he offered his coffee to a shivering man. And you have done nothing but humiliate." Rodrigo shot her a look of disdain but did not reply. Jimmy, with a gentle gesture, placed a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you, ma'am, but don't worry, I did not come seeking conflict." Turning back to the doctor, he added with a slight bow of his head, "I only hope you will one day understand that not everything that looks poor is insignificant." And with that, he returned to his seat. Rodrigo, his face tight with anger, turned sharply and walked away without another word. Perhaps out of pride, or perhaps because something in Jimmy's calm gaze unsettled him, Rodrigo walked away in silence. For a brief moment, the entire room fell still. Everyone present understood what had just happened. Some were uncomfortable, while others felt a quiet gratitude toward the stranger who, without raising his voice, had put arrogance in its place. Jimmy opened his Bible and scribbled a short line in the margin. "There are hearts sicker than bodies, and not all of them wear white coats." Outside, the clouds began to break, and rays of light filtered through. After the tense confrontation, Jimmy returned to his seat with the same serenity as before. His face carried no anger, only the peace of a man who had learned to look beyond offense. Still, the air held a lingering discomfort. Several patients looked at him with a mixture of admiration and shame, embarrassed that they had witnessed such disrespect. A little girl about 7 years old, wrapped in a pink wool hat, her wide eyes full of curiosity, slowly approached him. "Sir, would you sing again?" she asked in a soft, trembling voice. Jimmy's smile appeared instantly. That little one had been crying silently minutes earlier, feverish and shivering in her mother's arms, and now her mother stared in surprise at the request. "Did you like the hymn from before?" Jimmy asked gently. "Yes," she nodded. "My grandma says when someone sings beautifully, the pain becomes smaller." Jimmy chuckled warmly. "Your grandmother is a wise woman," he said, stroking the child's head tenderly, his voice soft as a prayer. Then, instead of one of his famous gospel songs, he began to hum a simple old hymn, one his own mother had sung to him when he was a boy. The melody was gentle, flowing with such tenderness that several patients lifted their heads, as if, for a moment, their pain had been paused. The girl's mother couldn't hold back her tears. An older woman whispered, "God bless you, young man." Even a nurse passing through the hallway slowed her steps to listen for a few seconds longer. When the hymn ended, the little girl suddenly wrapped her arms around his neck. Jimmy returned the embrace carefully, mindful of her frailty. Emotion touched him deeply. "Thank you," she whispered. "My head doesn't hurt as much now." Jimmy leaned closer and replied softly, "That is the power of praise. Sometimes it heals what medicine cannot." As minutes passed, more people began to gather near him, not asking for autographs, for no one had yet recognized him, but simply to talk, to share their stories, to find a bit of comfort. A middle-aged man with his arm in a sling sat beside him and began to speak, his voice heavy with fatigue. "My wife is worn out, you know, and I am too. But what hurts the most is how they treat us like garbage here just because we don't have private insurance." Jimmy listened without interruption, nodding slowly, then placed a firm hand on the man's shoulder. No one deserves to be treated that way, he said with conviction, especially not in a place where people come seeking help. Another woman, her eyes filled with tears, joined the circle. She spoke of her son, who had been waiting for test results for months without any answer. What began as casual conversation grew into a small gathering of confessions, a circle of broken hearts. Jimmy became their listener, their refuge, a safe harbor in the chaos of the hospital. Despite everything he witnessed, the disdain of the staff, the lack of empathy, the slowness of the system, Jimmy did not raise his voice. He simply took notes, etched every face and every story into his memory, and grew more certain within himself that it was not enough to invest money into buildings. Souls had to be touched. The heart had to be given back to the hospital. In a moment of silence, the little girl from before, now drowsy in her mother's arms, murmured softly, "Sir, you sing like the angel from my dreams." Her mother held her tightly. Jimmy closed his eyes. Something inside him broke tenderly. Outside, the clouds had cleared completely, and a beam of sunlight entered through the window, warming the room with a glow that came not only from the sky, but from something far deeper. It was the silent love of a man who, without revealing who he truly was already changing the lives of those around him. The waiting room no longer felt like a place of oppression marked by indifference. Instead, it had become warmer, more human. The change had not come from new machines or improved systems, but simply from the presence of a humble man whose empathy carried authority greater than titles, spreading respect and comfort among the suffering. Jimmy remained seated, surrounded now by people who no longer saw him as a stranger, but as a friend. His voice, his gaze, and his patience had begun to heal wounded hearts. Yet, there were still others higher up in the hospital who had yet to realize who this man with the deep eyes and humble smile truly was. As Jimmy was conversing with an elderly woman leaning on her cane, she explained she had been waiting 3 weeks for test results. An unusual movement at the main entrance disturbed the calm. A group of people in formal suits rushed in. Among them was a middle-aged man with neatly combed hair, fine glasses, and a visibly worried expression. He carried a folder in one hand and cell phone in the other, his assistants hurrying to keep up. "Where is he?" the man demanded urgently of a passing nurse. "Who, sir? Director?" she stammered nervously. "Mr. Swaggart," the director said sharply. "I've just been informed he is here in the emergency ward. Personally, and no one told me. This is unacceptable." The nurse paled, her eyes widening in shock. Jimmy Swaggart, the preacher, the benefactor, the man who gave millions so this hospital could even exist. And he is here, without announcement, without security, sitting like any ordinary patient. The director quickened his steps toward the waiting room. When he reached the doorway, he stopped dead in his tracks. There he was, sitting calmly, speaking gently with an elderly woman, resting his hand tenderly on the head of a sleeping little girl. For an instant, the director's eyes grew moist. He remembered the only time he had seen Swaggart in person, during a private dinner for benefactors, where Jimmy had spoken with passion about the need to humanize healthcare, to restore the soul of hospitals, to treat the poor with the same dignity as the rich. And now that very man was here, disguised as one of them, experiencing firsthand what so many had long denounced in silence. "Reverend Swaggart," the director whispered, approaching with reverence. Jimmy lifted his eyes. His face showed no surprise, only a warm acceptance. "Hello, Javier. It's good to see you," he said calmly. A murmur swept through the waiting room. Some patients stared at one another in disbelief. Others widened their eyes in shock. The little girl's mother pressed her hand to her chest. The elderly woman with the cane nearly dropped it in astonishment. "It's him," someone whispered. "He's the benefactor, the one who built this hospital," another said, stunned. The director approached quickly, clasping Jimmy's hand with both of his, like one greeting an old friend long lost. "Reverend, if you had only told us, we would have prepared everything, the boardroom, the reports, the reception." Jimmy interrupted him with a gentle smile. "And what for, Javier? I did not come to examine papers. I came to see what life is really like here, to know what it feels like to be treated without a title, without a face on television. And I have seen much. Ashamed, the director lowered his head. "I beg your pardon. I truly had no idea." "Do not apologize to me," Jimmy replied softly. "I am not the one who has been mistreated here. Look around you." He gestured toward the patients still seated. "Look into their faces, their stories, the elderly forgotten, the children ignored. That is the true examination your hospital must pass." Javier nodded slowly, his expression heavy. Just then, Rodrigo appeared at the entrance of the corridor, his white coat perfectly buttoned, a chart in hand. At first, he did not understand, but when he saw the director bowing in respect before the simple man in the corner, something inside him shifted. "What is happening here?" he demanded, crossing his arms. The director turned, his tone stern. "Rodrigo, allow me to introduce Reverend Jimmy Swaggart, the benefactor of this hospital. He has been here all morning, watching, listening, living among those you dismissed." The young doctor's face drained of color. His proud expression dissolved in seconds. "What? He is—" "Yes," Jimmy interrupted gently. "I am the same man you silenced, the same one you said had no place here." Rodrigo swallowed hard, a cold sweat running down his brow. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Suddenly, every eye in the room was upon him. He felt the crushing weight of every contemptuous word he had spoken that morning. Jimmy stood, not arrogantly, but with quiet firmness. "I did not come here to shame anyone. I came seeking humanity. And though I found it among the patients, I am still searching for it among some who wear the white coat." The silence was absolute. Rodrigo bowed his head, defeated by a single truth. He had judged by appearances, despised without understanding, and was now unmasked before all. Without further words, Jimmy turned to the sleeping child, lifted her gently into his arms, and handed her back to her mother. "Take her inside. She needs urgent attention. I will see to it." The mother could only whisper a trembling word of thanks. Everyone, patients and staff alike, watched him, not as if he were merely a famous preacher or a wealthy benefactor, but as if they were looking at something greater. A man with a soul. The director nodded silently and ordered that the girl be treated immediately. That day, something profound began to change within the walls of St. Gabriel Hospital, and it was only the beginning. Every person present held their breath, struggling to process what had just unfolded. The humble man who had shared words, hymns, and comfort was none other than Jimmy Swaggart, the same preacher many had heard on radio and television, and now revealed as the true benefactor behind the hospital. Rodrigo, the doctor who had humiliated him, stood frozen with a pale face, shrinking smaller with every passing second. His white coat no longer carried authority. His medical title had no weight against the moral greatness of the man he had scorned. Jimmy was not seeking revenge. There was no pride in his voice, no arrogance in his eyes, only a deep truth revealed not through grand speeches, but through quiet acts of compassion. That was why when Director Javier offered to move him into a private room, Jimmy refused with a gentle smile. "I'd rather remain here a while longer," he said softly. "There are still stories I need to hear." But Javier knew it was his duty to restore order. He stepped forward to the center of the room and raised his voice so all could hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to tell you something you should have known from the beginning. Reverend Jimmy Swaggart, the man you've seen sitting here as one of you, is the major benefactor of this hospital. Without him, these facilities would not exist. He gave not only resources, but vision. His desire was always that this hospital be guided by respect, dignity, and compassion for every human being, regardless of their background, their clothing, or their wealth." A wave of astonishment spread through the room. Some patients covered their mouths in shock. Others rose to their feet without knowing what to do, and a few began to clap timidly, as if not wanting to disturb the solemnity of the moment. Rodrigo stepped forward, utterly crushed by shame. His lips trembled. "Reverend Swaggart," he whispered, barely audible. "I had no idea. I committed an unforgivable mistake." Jimmy regarded him silently for a few seconds, then walked toward him without haste, with the same calmness he had shown when singing to the sick child. Stopping in front of him, he looked Rodrigo directly in the eyes. The silence in the room was absolute. "It is not me you must apologize to," Jimmy said gently. "It is to each of the people who waited for hours, treated as if they were worth nothing. I only came here to be one of them. And I was. I felt the contempt. I felt the indifference, but they, doctor, they live this every day. They do not have the option to go home tonight, knowing it will be different tomorrow. Rodrigo bowed his head, defeated by truth itself. No one pointed at him or insulted him. The judgment had already been delivered by his own actions. "Would you grant me a second chance?" Rodrigo murmured. "I don't want to be this kind of man any longer." Jimmy studied him carefully, then extended his hand. "True greatness is not in never failing," he answered. "It is in learning with humility. If you are willing to change, I am willing to believe in you." Rodrigo clasped his hand firmly, his eyes wet with tears. In that instant, something inside him broke, and something new began to be born. The director, holding back emotion, turned again to the crowd. "From this day forward, new directives will be put in place at this hospital. No patient will be ignored. Respect will be at the center of our practice. And I assure you, this is not just fine words for this moment. It is a real commitment that begins now." The applause this time was spontaneous, sincere, and even tears ran down the faces of those present. Jimmy quietly returned to his seat. There was no need for him to say more. His actions had spoken louder than 1,000 sermons. The hospital, once just a building with white walls, was beginning to transform into a true place of healing. That day was not merely the scene of a powerful revelation, it was the beginning of an awakening. Something deep had been stirred within every person in the waiting room of St. Gabriel Hospital. Jimmy Swaggart's silent way of teaching without imposing, of correcting without humiliating, had planted a seed that was now beginning to bear fruit. As the clapping faded and emotions slowly calmed, Jimmy sat naturally among the people again. He did not seek recognition nor honors. For him, the true value of this moment lay in what would come afterward, in the attitudes that would change, in the conscience that would grow. Director Javier, still moved, invited him to rest in a private room. Jimmy agreed, but requested that several members of the staff join them. He wanted no symbolic gesture, but a real conversation. He asked, in particular, that Rodrigo be present. Inside a modest, quiet room, they sat around a table. Jimmy leaned forward, resting his arms, and looked at each of them with eyes that did not judge, but invited reflection. "I want to share something with you," he began, his voice steady. "When I was 15, my mother fell ill. We lived in a very poor town. One day we walked miles to reach the nearest hospital. When we arrived, they treated us with disdain. They looked at us as if we did not deserve even a chair in the waiting room. I remember a doctor telling us to come back another day, that there were more urgent people to see. My mother died a week later, not for lack of medicine, but for lack of humanity." A heavy silence filled the room. No one dared interrupt. Rodrigo kept his eyes fixed on the table. "From that day on," Jimmy continued, "I knew that one day I would do something, not just for my mother, but for every mother, child, grandfather, and little girl who is ignored in places where they should be embraced. It does not depend on how much you have or how little. It depends on whether you look into the eyes of another person and see them as your equal." Rodrigo finally raised his eyes, red and moist. "Reverend," he said, his voice breaking, "there are no words to justify what I did today. I didn't realize what I was becoming. I entered this profession with a calling, but over time I hardened. I let myself be carried away by routine, by hurry, by pride." Jimmy nodded slowly. "It is human to fail," he said softly, "but it is also human to repent. That is what matters now." The head nurse, who was also present, spoke with emotion. "I have worked here for 15 years. I have seen wonderful doctors arrive with passion, only to burn out. This system drains us, wears us down. But what we saw today reminded us why we started. Reverend, without even revealing who you were, you gave us the most powerful lesson of all." Jimmy smiled gently. "And that lesson is not only for you," he said, "it is for me as well. Because even though I can help from the outside, I must also remember what it feels like to be on the inside. Sitting among those who suffer, waiting, listening, feeling." With a trembling voice, Rodrigo asked, "Is there something I can do now? Something real?" Jimmy looked at him with kindness. "Yes," he said. "You can come back tomorrow, and see each patient as if they were your own mother, your brother, your child. You can teach others to do the same. You can ask forgiveness and live the change sincerely. I don't ask you to be perfect. I ask you to be human. A new silence enveloped the room, not heavy or uncomfortable, but deep, transformative. Before leaving, Jimmy stood and shook each of their hands one by one. There was no reproach in his gesture, only a silent invitation to do better. And when he crossed once again through the central hallway of the hospital, the eyes that followed him no longer saw only a preacher or a benefactor. They saw a man with purpose, a man who had turned a painful memory into an opportunity to illuminate the hearts of others. That day, the hospital did not only treat bodies, it healed consciences. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in St. Gabriel Hospital was unlike anything before. As if a new spirit had been sown within its walls, something invisible yet undeniable began slowly transforming the routines of the place. What had once been done out of duty was now done with intention. What had once been spoken with impatience was now expressed with respect. The impact of Jimmy Swaggart's visit was not confined to a symbolic act or a single lesson. It was a moral awakening that reached every level, from the cleaning staff to the directors. His silent example remained alive, like an inner voice no one wanted to ignore again. Rodrigo, in particular, lived through a personal revolution. He had gone from arrogance to introspection. His workdays no longer began with haste, but with humility, arriving earlier, greeting each patient by name, and looking them in the eyes. At first, many were surprised. Some even thought it was a strategy to repair his image after what had happened. But over time, they saw his change was real. It was not an act, it was a genuine awakening. One morning, while reviewing medical files, Rodrigo saw the same elderly woman with the cane entering the waiting area, this time with her granddaughter. "Good morning, Doña Teresa," he said warmly, approaching her with kindness. "How are you feeling today?" The woman paused, studying him cautiously. Then after a few seconds, she smiled. "Better, doctor. But more than my knees, I'm surprised by how much your attitude has changed." Rodrigo nodded humbly. "I had to change," he said. "I learned that being a doctor is not just knowing anatomy. It is knowing how to listen, to ask forgiveness, and to heal with words." "That makes me glad," she replied, "because the deepest healing is sometimes not found in a prescription." Meanwhile, nurses who had long been accustomed to overwhelming stress now worked with better coordination, communicating with greater empathy, both with one another and with the patients. The lines were still long, but people noticed a difference. The air itself felt lighter. Utter, not because of new equipment, but because of the compassion that had begun to flourish. The lines were still long, but people had begun to notice something new. The atmosphere was different. Even the hallway seemed brighter, not because of sunlight, but because of the compassion that had begun to bloom where once there had only been indifference. In an internal meeting, Director Javier introduced a new plan for institutional renewal, which he called Restoring the Heart of St. Gabriel. It included training on compassionate care, spaces for active listening, moments dedicated to the emotional well-being of the staff, and most importantly, an open-door policy so that any patient who felt mistreated could be heard directly by the leadership team. "We cannot change the entire national health system," Javier admitted, "but we can change the part of the world entrusted to us, and that change has already begun." Jimmy, for his part, had returned to his usual ministry, but before leaving, he gave clear instructions. He would continue to make unannounced visits to the hospital, without security and without needing to be recognized. He wanted to keep seeing with his own eyes whether the seeds he had sown were bearing fruit. One afternoon, the staff were surprised to find a box at the reception desk. It had no sender's name. Inside were coffee thermoses engraved with phrases like, "Humility also heals. Treat others as you would want to be treated. Here, healing begins with respect." Everyone knew who had sent them, even though he never signed his name. Jimmy had left a mark that continued to grow, even in his absence. Rodrigo placed one of the thermoses on his desk. Every time he looked at it, he remembered the lesson he had received, not from a superior or a textbook, but from a simple man who had chosen to be treated as one of the least in order to reveal the heart of everyone else. The change was not instant nor perfect. Mistakes still happened, routines still needed correction, and wounds still needed healing. But the most important shift had already taken place. Someone had lit a spark, and that spark now burned brightly in the hearts of those who once performed only a function. Now they were living a mission. Months passed, and St. Gabriel Hospital began to truly transform, not just in infrastructure or medical technology, but in something far more valuable: its soul. Jimmy Swaggart, though maintaining a low profile, often returned. He never announced his arrivals and preferred to walk the halls with the same humility he had shown that first day. He was no longer the unknown man in the waiting room, but a respected and beloved figure, not for his fame, but for his genuine commitment to people. The staff had changed. Rodrigo, now a different kind of doctor, led by example, guiding a team that was more compassionate and attentive. Nurses and aides shared stories of how small daily gestures, like a warm greeting or a sincere smile, had made a difference in patients' lives. The hospital had begun continuous training programs centered on empathy and respect. New spaces were created where patients could share their concerns without fear, and a listening committee ensured that the stories of those in crisis were given priority. One afternoon, Jimmy visited the pediatric ward. There he saw the little girl in the pink hat, now radiant with a smile, playing with other children in a small playroom that had been set up thanks to one of his donations. Her mother recognized him immediately and approached with tears in her eyes. "Because of you, my daughter no longer fears coming to the hospital," she said emotionally. "Here, they don't just heal bodies anymore. They heal hearts." Jimmy looked at her tenderly and replied, "The real miracle is that she never lost her hope." As he walked down the hallways, groups of patients came to greet him. They didn't call him by name, but honored him for what he represented, a living symbol that dignity and compassion could walk hand in hand with medicine. In a meeting with the leadership team, Jimmy insisted that the transformation must continue. "We cannot allow this hospital to become merely a modern facility or a center of advanced technology," he said firmly. "It must remain a place where every person feels valued, heard, and respected. A hospital with a soul. That is what we must be." That phrase echoed through every corner, in every conversation, and in every small act of kindness. And though not every day was perfect, the collective will kept the change alive. One night as the hospital slept, Jimmy stood by a window, looking at the illuminated building. He thought back to that first day when he had arrived dressed simply and had been treated with indifference and contempt. He thought of every person he had met, every story he had heard. And he smiled, knowing this was only the beginning. The hospital was no longer just a place to heal bodies. It had become a refuge for weary souls, a sanctuary where respect and empathy were the true medicine. And so, without fanfare, Jimmy Swaggart left an indelible mark, a legacy that transcended his ministry and his fame. It was a legacy of humility, humanity, and true love, because in the end, that is what really heals.